It is a Throwback Thursday, so we're going to go back into Mets history and break down the 5 worst trades the Mets have ever made. Will the Jarred Kelenic deal make this list? How high up is the Midnight Massacre where the Mets traded Tom Seaver? We're going to discuss that on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans who are watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we're going through the top 5 worst trades in Mets history today. And before we get into that list, there's a few trades that I just wanted to mention, some honorable mentions here that I did not ultimately put on this list, but were certainly in consideration. The first being the trade to acquire Roberto Alomar, Hall of Famer Roberto Alomar, one of the best defensive second basemen of all time, goes to the Mets and was awful. We also have the 2 trades in the late 80s, first trading Kevin Mitchell, then trading Lenny Dykstra, 2 of those young outfielders that were part of the 1986 Mets. You would have thought the Mets would have tried to build around those guys. They instead sent them elsewhere for them to become MVP caliber players, with Mitchell winning the award. Dykstra, I don't believe he ultimately won an MVP, but he had some incredible years with the Phillies. He did not ultimately win an MVP, but he finished second in 1993. So those are a couple of the honorable mentions that did not crack this list. So let's move on, though, to our official top 5 here. And the 5th worst trade in Mets history was trading Scott Kazmir to the then Devil Rays, if I'm not mistaken, to get Victor Zambrano. Zambrano wasn't great as a Met, a 4.42 ERA over 3 years, only made 35 starts, dealt with a ton of injuries, was supposed to help the Mets get over the top around the same time they got Chris Benson. That team never panned out. Those guys never panned out. Meanwhile, Kazmir, who was the Mets' top pitching prospect at the time, went on to have a really nice career, pitched to a 3.92 ERA across 144 starts with the Rays over those next 6 years. 834 innings. That would have been far more valuable to the Mets than Victor Zambrano. Coming in at number 4, we have the Jeff Kent trade. Prior to the 1996 trade deadline, the Mets sent Jeff Kent and Jose Vizcaino to the Indians for Alvaro Espino and Carlos Baerga. Vizcaino was a solid utility infielder, continued to be that after his time with the Mets. Espinoza, also a utility infielder, had actually a pretty good season with the Mets after the trade, hit 306, 324 on base, 474 slugging in 48 games. But really, this was a Kent for Baerga trade, and Baerga had 3 years with the Mets, 306 games, hit 18 home runs, hit 267, 302 on base, 373 slugging. Not horrible, but certainly not great, especially when you see what Jeff Kent did. Now, to be fair, the Mets traded Jeff Kent to the Indians, and the Indians then traded him to the Giants. So 2 teams were wrong on Jeff Kent. It wasn't just the Mets, but you look at the career that Jeff Kent went on to have with the Giants, 6 years, hit 297, 368 on base, 535 slugging, 175 home runs during that 6-year span, was an all-star 3 times, finished top 10 in MVP voting 4 times, won the award outright in 2000 when he had 80 extra base hits and hit over 330 that season. He finished his career as the all-time leader in home runs for a second baseman. The Mets had him. They traded him. One of the worst trades in Mets history to give up on a player that is not in the Hall of Fame, but I think certainly has an argument. I don't know if he ever will get in through a veterans committee or anything like that. down the line there is a chance if they go back and they recognize him. And I think part of the problem for Kent is he is a little bit of an in-betweener because I don't ever remember any real connection of Kent to steroids, but he played at the height of the steroid era. He was the guy, the Robin to Barry Bonds' Batman. And so when Batman's all roided up, do you think Robin was also maybe on the juice as well? Again, as far as I can recollect, never did have those direct ties. His numbers maybe don't pop as much in this steroid era compared to the other juiced monsters that were out there every day. But, he put up a ton of home runs. He had a lot of success with the Giants. If I had a Hall of Fame vote, I'd probably lean towards voting Jeff Kent as a Hall of Famer just based on what he did at a position where you don't see that level of power, how good he was for that many years. And it is just unfortunate that it wasn't in a Mets uniform because, again, they had him in. Jeff Kent maybe wasn't what he became with the Giants when he was with the Mets, but he was still a solid hitter. His career average with the Mets was over 270. So to not, keep him was certainly one of the top 5 worst trades in Mets history, in my opinion. But I don't think either of those two trades even get close to matching the top 3 trades, or top 3 worst trades, I should say, in Mets history. The next one is one that we're all familiar with. The Jarred Kelenic trade comes in at number 3 for now, with the chance for it to get higher over the years as his career continues. I'll talk about that trade a little bit more in just a minute. This is the time of year where I've usually just given up on my New Year's resolutions in the past, but not this year. This year, I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right. And that is all thanks to Built Bar, because honestly, it doesn't even really feel like a resolution because I really enjoy eating them. They have these new Built Bar Puffs, which are the first ever protein infused marshmallow, which is just fluffy and delicious. They're not just a protein bar, they're a treat to come covered in 100% real chocolate with flavors like the cinnamon churro, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie. These are also good. You're going to want to try them. And also, if you want to try just the traditional Built Bars, you got flavors like mint brownie, coconut almond, and new for this month, the white chocolate cookies and cream. I'm already tearing my way through that first box. I want to get another one in the mail as soon as possible. And when I do, I'll go to built.com and I'm going to use the promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off my next order. You can do the same. Just go to built.com, see all the flavors they got, get a mixed box, try a bunch of different flavors, see which ones you like best. And again, when you check out, make sure you use that promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off at built.com. All right, so now we are at the Jarred Kelenic trade, which when it was made, there was already some who were said this is going to be the worst trade in Mets history. And it certainly has that potential. Jarred Kelenic goes on to be a Hall of Famer. This is going to be right up there with some of, if not the worst trades in Mets history. It's already there at number 3, in my opinion. And that's just based on the entire scope of the deal and the context of it. This was the last ditch effort of a bygone era of Mets baseball. This was the last massive mistake, although there was still others after it, that the Jeff Wilpon-led Mets made. You just look at where the Mets could be right now. And it's a whole episode of Locked On Mets that we're going to do at some point, just going back in time and imagining if Steve Cohen got to buy the Mets after the 2018 season, how much things could be different. Because that trade, which Bernie Van Wagenen gets blamed for, is completely, in my opinion, because of Jeff Wilpon and the context of where the Mets were. He knew that there was going to be a sale at some point in the near future. You've seen what's happened since. We're now armed with hindsight, but the Mets were not going to be, or the Wilpons were not going to be able to hold on to the Mets for much longer. So they are interviewing GMs. Jeff Wilpon is, and he lands on Bernie Van Wagenen. Why? Because Chaim Bloom told him the proper thing to do with the money that the Mets had to allocate towards their budget was to tear it down and start over. Well, the Wilpons, why would they want to go through a rebuild if they're about to give up the team? Why would Jeff want to do that? So instead, he hires the guy that is the sports agent, the smooth talker, says, hey, we can get creative, baby. Let's do it. Let's win. We got it. They're on the golf course. They're having a good time. Let's do it. All right, I'll get DeGrom. He had DeGrom as his client. I'll make sure DeGrom signs long term. We're going to make some trades. We're going to make some moves. We're going to make something happen. That trade, again, people always talk about the money the Mets absorbed in that deal. That's why it's a horrible trade, because they had to take on the Cano contract and they didn't get enough value out of having to acquire that contract when they only get Edwin Diaz and they give up Jarred Kelenic and Justin Dunn to make that trade. But again, what people forget about is for the 2019 Mets, the Mets saved money on their books. So when Bernie Van Wagenen was going through his checklist of what I have to do to fill out this roster and win it all in 2019, he wanted a middle of the order at bat, or middle of the order bat. That was Cano. He wanted a new closer. That was Diaz. And he gets those two needs filled, and he saves money on the books for 2019 because the salaries of Anthony Swarzak and Jay Bruce, which went back to the Mariners in that trade, plus the money that they were eating on the Cano contract, ended up being like a net of a $500,000 save for the Mets in 2019. Now, look at their books in 2020, 2021, 2022. All of those years, yes, huge loss for the Mets, but they were thinking short term at the time. So for 2019, they save money. They deal with they address two of their big needs, and they send out two top prospects to get that done. Now, since then, what we've seen is Edwin Diaz maybe is the best player in this trade still. I mean, he hasn't been great with the Mets. He's pitched to a 4 ERA, but a lot of that was due to his really bad 2019 season. In 2020 and 2021, he's been good. But he hasn't been the guy he was in Seattle, where he pitched to a 2.64 ERA, had 109 saves during that span, still 49 more than he's had, or 45 more than he's had in his 3 years with the Mets. And he also had the 57 save season before coming to the Mets. Hasn't had any year anywhere close to that in a Mets uniform. But of the players dealt, he's probably been the most impactful. Still, you look at Justin Dunn. 2021, he had a 3.75 ERA across 11 starts. That is a pitcher right now that you would love to have competing with David Peterson and Tyler McGill for that 5th spot in the Mets rotation, but he's in Seattle. Jarred Kelenic has not been great, or at least he wasn't great in his first year with the Mariners. Had a really bad season. According to Baseball Reference, his WAR last year was negative 1.8, so he was well below average. But in September and October, he hit 248, 331 on base, 524 slugging, had 7 home runs, started to really become a vocal fan favorite on that team. He was part of the, why not us? You got to believe type stuff that they were doing out there in Seattle as they were trying to make the playoffs. He's a key figure in what they're planning on doing moving forward. And I would be really surprised if he didn't figure it out and become the all-star performer we've all expected him to become. And the more Kelenic does, the worse this trade's going to look, because if the Mets didn't make that move, I mean, maybe you didn't sign Mark Canha this offseason. Maybe the Mets just go out and get Starling Marte. But you look at an outfield of the future and actually having Kelenic, it just makes so much of a difference. We've been doing a lot of prospect talk over the past couple of weeks, and we've talked a lot about the lack of depth the Mets have when it comes to their outfield prospects. This was the first guy they sent out. They just traded Pete Armstrong as well. That's 2 massive hits to a farm system in one position. To trade 2 potential all-star type center fielders, we don't know what they're going to become. Neither of them could get there. They might just be regular MLB starters. They might even be worse than that. Who knows? Maybe Kelenic will put up bad numbers every year. We'll look back and maybe Diaz is closing Game 7 of the World Series in 2022, and you think, you know what, it was all worth it. And maybe Cano is a big factor this year as well. That can still happen. But you look at the net result, and you just right now, if someone was to ask you, who would you want on your 2022 roster, Jarred Kelenic and Justin Dunn, or Robinson Cano and Edwin Diaz, there's no doubt about it. Everyone would take Kelenic and Dunn, especially when you factor in the $27-ish million I would imagine the Mets are going to be paying Cano and Diaz this year. Diaz, he's going to start getting expensive now in arbitration. Cano, they're paying $20.25 million for him a year. It's an ugly deal. But again, it can still go a lot of ways. That's why it comes in at number 3, because if Kelenic isn't great, you're going to look at the trade differently. And if the Mets do a lot of winning over the next 2 years and Cano and Diaz are a big part of it, you will be able to swallow that loss a little bit more if they are key contributing factors to a championship. But that's pretty much the only way the Mets come out of this in a positive way. And again, it's frustrating because it was a deal that was born out of desperation from an ownership group that was just hanging on by a thread, as we've learned since. But luckily, the Mets have Steve Cohen now in place, and hopefully trades like this won't happen in the future, trades that are so monetarily based. Anyway, though, there's still two trades that are way worse. Two Hall of Fame pitchers that shared a championship rotation for the Mets that were both dealt by this franchise. You know them well, Nolan Ryan and Tom Seaver. Which one comes in at number one? We'll discuss that more in just a minute. There might be less football being played, but BetOnline.net has way more stuff to bet on this playoff season. From scores, totals, player performance props to where the next fire coach is going to land, BetOnline is the number one spot for all things NFL betting in 2022, and it's not just football. BetOnline.net's basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC odds coverage is the best in the business. From sports right down to your favorite Vegas casino games, BetOnline is your number one online wagering destination. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports and play your favorite games. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, this was a really tough decision for me, which one to put at number one, which trade to put at number two, because everyone is going to say that Tom Seaver trade is the worst in Mets history because it's trading Tom Seaver. But if we're really to just look at the nuts and bolts of the deals, you could probably make the argument that the Nolan Ryan trade is worse because what they got back in Jim Fregosi is so much worse than what the Mets got back for Seaver. Like Seaver, they actually got back a couple of players that were pretty solid in Pat Zachary and Steve Henderson. But we're going to talk about that in a second here because the Nolan Ryan trade comes in at number two because I can't get past the fact that the Mets traded the greatest player in franchise history. Nothing is worse than that, regardless of the result. That fact alone, what that meant just to cripple a fan base if you're a Mets fan in the 70s, and this is the franchise, literally his nickname, the franchise, you just can't get past that. So even if like Jarred Kelenic goes on and is a Hall, let's just say Kelenic and Dunn both have Hall of Fame careers for the Mariners. They win 5 World Series championships for the Mariners. The Mariners become a dynasty, and Dunn's the ace, and Kelenic's an MVP, which is highly unlikely that all of that would come together. But let's just say all of those things ended up happening, and that trade just looked worse and worse and worse. I still don't think you put it over Seaver because, again, he's the most significant player in this franchise's history. He should have spent his entire career wearing one jersey, and they traded him. But the Nolan Ryan trade, which comes in at 2, is so bad as well. The Mets trade Nolan Ryan, Don Ross, Francisco Estrada, and Leroy Stanton for Jim Fregosi. Now, none of them really amounted to much outside of Ryan, although Leroy Stanton was like a competent right fielder for the Angels for 5 seasons. So that isn't nothing, but really just to give up Nolan Ryan, who ended up being a Hall of Famer, of course, the all-time strikeout leader. He pitched to a 2.28 ERA the first season he was away from the Mets, was an all-star for the first time that year, led the league in strikeouts in 7 of his 8 seasons with the Angels, was a 5-time all-star during that span, was a top 3 Cy Young finisher 3 times as an Angel. And also, the one that maybe hurts Mets fans the most is he pitched 4 no-hitters with the Angels. And of course, the Mets did not have a no-hitter until Johan Santana, and that one even has the asterisk of the Carlos Beltran hit down the line that may or may not or totally did hit chalk. I'm not trying to take it away from Johan. I'm a Mets fan, but we all know that there's still that lingering bit of insecurity for Mets fans when it comes to the no-hitter discussion because the Mets have just been so unlucky in that regard. And again, maybe it is the curse of the Nolan Ryan trade because he would have so many no-hitters in his career, particularly all those no-hitters with the Angels. He is, as I already said, the all-time strikeout leader, 5,714 strikeouts. And I found a way to put that into context for you. Max Scherzer has been incredible throughout his career, a great strikeout pitcher, right? He's at 3,020 strikeouts. So for him to pass Nolan Ryan, and hey, he's going to pitch for a long time. Scherzer said he's not going to stop until the wheels come off. Who knows? Maybe he has another decade in him. Maybe he'll be like Nolan Ryan, pitching well into his 40s. He would have to average 300 strikeouts for 9 seasons to pass Nolan Ryan. Think about that. 9 more seasons of 300 strikeouts. He's not doing that. I mean, he might not even have 9 more 200. Hey, who knows he's even going to pitch for 5 more seasons? It's insane. Randy Johnson got within 1,000, and that's a miracle. Okay? No one's touching Nolan Ryan's strikeout record. And Fregosi with the Mets, in case you were curious, hit 233, 319 on base, 328 slugging, had 5 home runs in 146 games, played parts of 2 seasons with the Mets, and was ultimately sold to the Rangers, about a year after the Mets traded for him. So just an awful trade. And like I said, if you want to say, if you take like the sentimentality out of it, maybe it is the worst trade in Mets history, but Tom Seaver going to the Reds is the worst. June 15th, 1977, Midnight Massacre. As I said, though, the Mets actually got some decent players in that trade, but they just never could crawl out from the shadow of having gotten traded for Tom Seaver. You had Pat Zachary, who was a solid starter for the Mets, had 6 seasons with the team, 3.63 ERA, was an all-star in 1978. Steve Henderson finished runner-up in the Rookie of the Year voting with the Mets. Hit 287, 360 on base, 423 slugging in 4 seasons. Was a good player. Ended up getting traded for Kingman to get him back, who was part of another trade during the Midnight Massacre. So it was a way to kind of appease fans a bit to bring back Kingman and ultimately bring back Seaver as well. But, Tom Seaver, 6 years with the Reds, pitched to a 3.18 ERA, and also, again, to Mets fans' dismay, had a no-hitter in another uniform with the Reds as well. So you break it all down, 5 worst trades in Mets history. I have at number 5, the Scott Kazmir trade. Number 4, Jeff Kent. Number 3, the Jarred Kelenic deal. Number 2, Nolan Ryan. Number 1, Tom Seaver. If you disagree with me and you're watching on YouTube, make sure you leave a comment below. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube page. That's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, review, wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, at Locked On Mets. On tomorrow's show, we have another Friday Farm Report with Jordan Grossman as we're going through our top 20 prospects in the Mets system. So make sure you tune into that. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Locked On Bets is where you want to go for all your daily gambling needs. You can follow Locked On Bets wherever you get podcasts.